Welcome everyone. Like we said, tonight we're going to be talking about some considerations for selecting and purchasing hay, kind of going through a checklist of things, if you will, as you're looking at either purchasing or kind of inventorying your feedstuffs and your forages for winter and making some feeding decisions going into the winter months. So obviously, most of us are familiar with hay, right? We know that hay is essentially drying and packaging forage for preservation so that we can later feed it to our animals. But there are a lot of steps involved in the process of hay making, and a lot of us who routinely purchase or source hay or forages, stored forages for our livestock, we may not be the ones that are actually growing and producing that hay. So we're going to talk about some of the things that make up the haymaking process, some of the things to look for as you're making your selection of different hays to purchase. So we're not going to really talk about the haymaking process, but just really quickly for those who aren't very familiar with it, the haymaking process essentially involves, a mower or harvester of some sort in the field, cutting that forage or mowing that forage so that it's, removed from continuing to grow. Then that harvested forage is left in the field to dry. This can take, anywhere from 2 to 4 days, depending on weather conditions usually. After it has reached an appropriate moisture, it has dried enough, that hay is then raked up into windrows. And this essentially just rakes the hay into kind of neat little rows so that you can come along with the baler and collect those windrows and actually make that harvested forage into the baled hay. So those are kind of the major steps in the haymaking process. And as livestock owners, if we're not involved in this process, we know that we still need hay because oftentimes we, maybe don't have enough pasture to support our animals for, 365 days a year. There are, of course, likely times of the year when pasture may not be available, like in the winter. Even if we don't have a lot of snow cover, sometimes our forages may be dormant. We may have grazed off any, stockpiled forage or anything like that. And we need to supply hay to get through the winter months. Could also be in the middle of the summer if we have a really bad drought. I know this last year, a lot of areas of the country were very dry. And sometimes during a really bad drought, our pastures are not regrowing and we need to rely on stored forages like hay to get us through those dry months until we can hopefully get some rain again. There may also be times when we need to either rest or renovate some of our pastures. So we may need to confine animals to a dry lot or use a sacrifice paddock of some sort and feed hay in that area. And then anytime we need to confine our livestock, whether that's an animal that was sick that we're needing to treat, whether we're transporting animals to take them somewhere, maybe a show or something like that, there are lots of times during the year when we're going to need some hay. So like I mentioned, we're going to go through kind of a list of how to decide if hay is appropriate for purchase for our operation. And we'll go through a bunch of different criteria and kind of talk through some different points and some different things to consider. So we're going to start with the type or size of the hay bale. And essentially this is just figuring out what works best for our farm. So there's, a lot of different types of hay and they come in different size packages. For example, a very common one is small square bales. Like you can see on the right there, these are usually in the kind of 40 to 80 pound range. So they're small enough that, you can usually lift and move them around manually. So because they're a little bit smaller, they're easier to handle, maybe easier to move around, easier to store because you can fit them in smaller areas. But they may be a little bit more labor intensive in terms of, it usually requires some human labor to move those around, stack them, feed them, all kinds of things. Also, if you think about, food at the grocery store, oftentimes it's more expensive to buy things in smaller quantities or smaller packages versus buying things in bulk. And the same kind of concept usually applies to hay purchases. So oftentimes small square bales can be a little bit more expensive on a dollars per ton basis compared to some of our larger type hay bales. But that said, they're still very common on smaller farms, farms with fewer animals, farms that don't need, really large quantities of hay or don't have the equipment to handle the larger bales. So they're still used very widely in the livestock industry. On the flip side, we have our large square or large round bales. So these usually are in the 800 to 1200 pound range as far as weight. And so they typically require a tractor or a skid steer or some sort of equipment to be able to move those hay bales around. So they can be less labor intensive, assuming we have the equipment to handle that and to have the capacity to do that. Like I mentioned, a lot of times things that we buy in bulk or in larger packages can be less expensive on a dollar per ton basis. We'll talk about kind of cost comparisons here in a little bit. And it's important to note that larger bales may be a little bit less practical if we have fewer animals. And this is because they're not able to get through that hay fast enough. If we set a whole large round bale out in a pasture or in a paddock and we have, just two sheep that are, feeding on that round bale, they're not going to be able to eat through that hay very quickly. And it's going to be more likely that that hay is going to start to spoil, especially as it's exposed to the elements, if it's not eaten in like a relatively reasonable time frame. So sometimes if we have fewer animals that we're feeding at a time, it may be a better idea to have a smaller bale and be feeding less at a time. So that's really just depends on, your operation and what might work best for you. The next two kind of criteria I'm going to sort of combine together, and that's because these really are tied together when we're talking about hay purchase decisions. So affordability, how much does the hay cost, and bale weight. And bale weight is really going to tie into that affordability factor, and we'll talk through an example here in a second. But for this, it's really important to know both the price and the weight of the hay that you're purchasing. So you want to be able to calculate the best bang for your buck, essentially, the most cost-effective option. And to do that, you need to know the price and the weight so you can make comparisons on a per weight basis or a dollar per ton basis, because different hay bales, even within small squares, even within large rounds, will weigh different amounts depending on how dense the bale was when it was made and how big the bale was when it was made. The diameter of larger bales, things like that will all affect how much weight a given bale has. So it's really important to be able to know the average weight when we're making cost comparisons. So as an example, if we have here 100 hay bales, small squares that are $5 each, that of course, adds up to about $500. And if we have a second option, option number 2, 100 small square bales, let's just say for this example's sake that they're similar forage quality. But in this case, these are $6 each. So just looking at that, we're going to say, well, it probably makes more sense to buy the small squares on the left, right? Because we'll save ourselves $100. Well, here's where the weight makes a difference. So let's say in this example, the bales on the left weigh 35 pounds each. So they're slightly smaller, a little bit lighter, maybe easier to lift or to carry around. But if we add up the total weight there, we accumulate up to 1.75 tons. And if the bales on the right weigh 50 pounds each instead of 35, that means our total weight for those hay bales is actually 2.5 tons. So if you calculate the cost of both of these two scenarios based on the dollars per ton, it actually comes out to $286 per ton for the hay on the left versus $240 per ton for the hay on the right. So that just kind of illustrates why it's important to make these comparisons on a per weight basis, because you may be able to save yourself some money. If the bale is a little bit more expensive, but it's heavier and it weighs more, you may be able to kind of use that to get a little bit more of an affordable option. This same process can also be used to make comparisons between small square and large round bales. So, I mentioned that oftentimes small square bales may be a little bit more expensive on a dollar per ton basis. Well, you can answer that question. You can figure that out. So if we have, the same scenario on the left, 100 small square bales at $5 each, and we're comparing that to 10 large round bales and say these are $70 each, you can follow these same steps. So again, the ones on the left, 35 pounds each. The ones on the right, in this case, we're going to say these weigh 800 pounds each. So our total weight there is 4 tons, with 800 pounds times 10 bales, 4 tons. And if you divide these out, it's actually cheaper, in this case, to go with the large round bales. So this is really important when we're making our hay purchasing decisions. We want to be comparing hay based on the weight and on the dollar per ton basis rather than just on the cost of the individual bale. The next question that we want to ask ourselves is, what is the nutritional value or the quality of that hay? This is really important for a very wide variety of reasons. And we're going to spend a little bit of time touching on a few things related to hay quality and how to decide if hay is an appropriate quality for the animals that we have on our operation. So forage quality varies based on a huge number of different factors. And we're going to do a quick poll. If we could start the first poll. The question here is going to be, what is the greatest determinant or factor affecting forage quality? So you should hopefully be seeing that poll popped up on your screen if you want to go ahead and answer what you think the biggest factor affecting forage quality is. We'll give it a few seconds for some answers to trickle in. So your options here are forage species, stage of maturity, leaf to stem ratio, time of year. And the question is, what is the greatest factor affecting forage quality? All right, can you guys see the results? I'm not sure I can see them, but I can't tell if you guys can see them or not. But we have, let's see, 61% said stage of maturity, 17% said both forage species and time of year, and 6% said leaf to stem ratio. So good job, everyone. Stage of maturity is usually the greatest factor affecting forage quality. So that's great. Most of you, a majority of you got the answer correct there. But forage quality does depend on all of these factors, right? So leaf to stem ratio, forage species differences, harvested versus fresh forage, like in a pasture that's being grazed, soil fertility, the time of day or year, harvest and storage conditions, any anti-nutritive factors that may be kind of present in the hay that are undesirable, pasture and grazing management, if we're in a grazing situation, all of these different things can affect forage quality. So we don't have obviously time to go through this whole list of factors, but we're going to touch on a few keys and talk just a little bit about when we're looking at hay, what things we can look for to kind of help assess forage quality and decide if hay is appropriate or not. So really there's two methods for evaluating hay quality. The first is to actually take a forage test or a forage analysis. And the second is to do more of a visual assessment and kind of just look at the hay and look at some different factors and see, visually what the hay looks like. I will say that a forage test or a forage analysis is really the gold standard for evaluating hay quality. So this is really the best way to evaluate hay quality. And it's the only thing that's going to actually tell us how much nutrients are present in that hay. So how much protein, how much energy, how much fiber. So that's really the only way to know what nutrients are present in our hay. We can tell some things visually. We can make some general assumptions, but really it's not going to be able to compare to an actual forage test. And to kind of illustrate that point here, that forage nutritive value or the forage quality can only be evaluated with a forage analysis. There was an interesting little experiment done at one of the forage conferences several years ago where they had 4 different hays, which you can see here, hay A, B, C, and D. And they didn't tell people the quality. They just asked people to visually assess the hays and rank them from best to worst. What you're seeing here is the actual quality of the hay, which they didn't tell people. So hay D was the best quality, hay A was the worst quality. And this meeting was like, forage specialists and livestock specialists and people working in the industry and some producers, a wide variety of different people. And this is the percentage of people that guessed that each of those hays was the best. So 45% thought that hay A was the best quality hay, even though it was actually the worst. Only 20% actually correctly guessed that hay D was the best quality hay. So just illustrating the fact that while we can tell some things visually, a forage test is really important to be able to actually assess the quality and tell what nutrients are in our hay. So we're not going to talk a lot about forage sampling tonight, but I just really briefly wanted to mention for those who are interested maybe in taking a forage sample, if you already have hay or if you're able to take it before you can buy the hay, even better. But the goal with forage sampling is to take a really large lot of hay and hundreds of pounds of material that's usually very variable and boil that down into a single small sample that's actually analyzed by the lab. So you can see there, that's a NIR analysis machine and scanning that NIR sample for forage quality. So there's a lot of variability that goes into that tiny little sample that gets analyzed, right? So how we take our forage sample is really important. So just some really quick things, takeaways for forage sampling. We want to be taking at least 20 cores from random hay bales, and we want to be sampling these across flakes or through the layers. So that would be through the rounded side for large round bales or into the butt end for small square bales. So we're kind of getting a core through all the different layers of that hay. So for small square bales, we can, do 1 core per bale. For larger bales, since we usually have fewer of those, we can take a couple cores per large bale. And we want to combine all that into, a final sample that we'll send to the lab. And you can see in the bottom left there why we recommend taking multiple random cores. So those were one single lot of hay that was supposed to be pretty uniform, harvested from a single field. And there's 20 different cores listed there. And you can see the energy content from each of those cores was different depending on what hay bale and what, how much leaf versus stem material it happened to be in that sample. So we need to take a representative sample by kind of randomly sampling across all of our hay. It's not usually recommended to take a grab sample. And by grab sample, I mean just, grabbing random handfuls of hay and using those. Ideally, we'd have a forage sampler or a probe or drill of some sort that we could drill into the bale with. And this is because when we take a grab sample, we usually underestimate the quality of that hay because some of the leaf material that's really high in quality usually crumbles out through your handful and you maintain more of the stem content from that forage. So here you can see they compared hay cores versus grab samples. And when they did the analysis, the grab samples underestimated crude protein and energy and overestimated fiber content for that hay. So if you can at all, it's nice to have a hay probe and be able to sample your hay in that way. And then the last step really is making sure samples are labeled appropriately. I've heard many stories from the forage labs, how, people submit samples without their contact information, without a way to identify what the sample is, all that kind of stuff. So make sure samples are labeled. And then the important thing here is to send them to an accredited lab. So there's a group called the National Forage Testing Association that will ensure quality standards are met by different forage testing labs. And as long as the lab has accreditation through a group like this NFTA, they should be a reputable lab. We do have a list of a few of them on our website, but there are probably also a lot of labs that are more local to you all in your location. So when you get the sample back from the lab, you're going to get this huge, piece of paper with all this information, and it's going to contain a huge number of different quality factors. We're not going to have time to go through all of these today, but you can think of the forage analysis as kind of the nutrition facts label. So it tells you how much protein is in there, how much fiber is in there, how much energy is in there, different nutrients like calcium or phosphorus, things like that. So it tells us a lot of really good information, and we can use this then when we're like balancing rations or things like that. So why we might want to do a forage analysis, well, we can assign a market value. So if we're purchasing or selling hay, like we're talking about here, we know the value of that hay based on the forage analysis and the quality of that hay. When we're considering different feeding decisions, we can better match the forage quality of the hay to the animal requirements. And we'll talk about how to do that here in a little bit. And we can formulate rations and determine what supplements are needed to make sure we're meeting all the nutrient requirements of our animals. And we can also make some storage decisions. For example, if we have a limited amount of storage, we might want to choose to store our highest quality forage inside and maybe our lower quality forage outside to make sure we maintain the quality and preserve the quality on our best and most expensive forage. So we don't have time, like I said, to go through a whole forage analysis tonight, but I did throw an example of the YouTube video out there that is going through a forage analysis. There's a lot of different YouTube videos. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to find a video that kind of walks through that and help you through the process. So that is the forage analysis or forage testing side of things. I mentioned that we can also kind of look at the quality of hay through a visual assessment. And there are things, even though visual is not up to the same standard as an actual forage test, there are things we can look for when we're visually assessing hay. And this is usually really important when we're buying or purchasing hay because we don't always have the opportunity to do a forage analysis before we purchase or buy the hay. In some cases we might, but not all the time. So we're going to talk through some things we can look for visually when we're looking at hay and deciding if we're going to purchase hay. So we already answered, the question earlier, which is the most important factor affecting forage quality, and forage maturity is really the greatest determinant here with nutritional value. So forage that was harvested or cut at a more vegetative state will be more leafy, have higher energy, more protein, more of a vegetative material like you see there on the left, versus something that's more mature is going to be a little bit more stemmy. It's going to have higher fiber. It's going to be a little bit lower in overall quality. Visually, you can see there what it looks like while it's growing in the field. Here you can see what it might look like in an actual hay sample. So visual indicators of maturity when it comes to hay, we can look for things like seed heads, if it's a grass hay, flowers, if it's a legume hay like alfalfa. We can look for the presence of stems, and we can see if there are more or less stems and how thick those stems are. So if we're looking at these two samples here, if you look where the white arrows are pointing, you can see some seed heads present in that sample on the right. And that is a more mature grass hay compared to the sample on the left, which is a little bit more of an immature grass hay. You don't really see any seed heads there. We see a lot less stem material present. We see a lot more leaves there. So that one would be a better quality sample on the left compared to the more mature grass hay on the right. And I actually have a forage analysis for these examples, so you can see this backs up our visual estimate there, with the forage on the left having a little bit higher protein, a little bit lower fiber, and a little bit higher overall forage quality compared to that more mature grass hay on the right.
Uh, uh, Dr. Amanda, could you explain what is the RFV, please?
Yeah, so RFV stands for relative feed value, and it's basically a calculation that the forage lab can make that tries to encompass all the different quality factors like protein, digestibility, all the different quality factors, and they do it in a calculated equation, and it basically reflects kind of the overall forage quality. So it's not like a nutrient that an animal needs, but it's a number that's used to compare different hay samples or different lots of hay and compare the quality against other hay products, if that makes sense.
And yeah, and generally when it's over 100 is better than the average of them. Is that true?
Yeah, so the standard for relative feed value is 100, which is an alfalfa sample at full bloom. And so anything above that is going to be considered a higher quality, and then anything below that is going to be considered a lower quality. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So along with maturity, we can also think about hay cutting. So cutting, for those who aren't familiar with that term, is just the number associated with whatever time a hay field was cut during the growing season. So first cutting just means it was the first time that field was cut for the year. Second cutting, the second time it was cut. Third cutting, the third time it was cut, etc. So if we have here kind of an example of, a growth curve for some common cool season forages like orchard grass, could also be like tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, any of those kind of cool season forages. We see a lot of forage growth happening in the spring and in the fall. And hay cutting simply means, first time it was cut, sometime in the spring, second time it was cut in the summer. And when exactly this will happen will vary a lot depending on, who's making the hay, the weather, how the, conditions are in the field. And third cutting, usually sometime in the fall. But again, those dates will vary, just illustrating, first, second, and third cutting. And here's where your next poll is. So if we could do poll number 2, this one is true or false. First cutting hay is lower quality. So go ahead, I'll give everybody a minute to put in their answer for that. Tell us true or false if you think first cutting hay is lower quality. Give you just a couple more seconds. All right, so we have 39% said true and 61% said false. So this is maybe a tricky one. Those of you who said false, you are correct. First cutting hay doesn't necessarily have to be lower quality. And when I say that, it really is because it all depends on maturity. So every single cutting of hay can be really good quality. Every single cutting of hay can be lower in quality. It really depends on the timing and the maturity of that forage when it was harvested. The reason a lot of people think that this is a true statement is in the springtime, the first time, a field is being harvested for the year, oftentimes it's a little bit more rainy, it's a little bit wetter weather. Sometimes farmers have a harder time getting into those fields in a timely manner and getting hay dry because the weather is wet and a little more rainy. Sometimes they're busy, doing other tasks. They may be growing other crops, planting other crops, establishing other crops. So they can be a little bit delayed getting into the field for a variety of reasons. And as they're delayed, those forages are getting a little bit more mature, which is sometimes why first cutting hay can be a little bit lower in quality. But it's not because it's the first cutting, it's because of the maturity of that forage when it was cut. Hopefully that makes sense for everybody. So tied really closely with maturity is leafiness. So leaves are always higher quality compared to the stems. And the leaves are going to be the most nutrient rich part of the plant. So they're going to have the highest quality material in the leaves. And I say it's closely tied to maturity because as forages mature, as they, grow and they continue to mature, the leaf percentage will decrease and the stem percentage will increase. So we see this change in the leaf and stem percentage as forages mature. So that's part of the reason why a more vegetative forage is going to be higher quality because it's going to have a higher percentage of leaves compared to stems. And they actually did some work in Wisconsin looking at a huge variety of different hay types and trying to figure out what caused the most variability in hay quality. And they essentially found that leaf percentage was the #1 factor that accounted for the most variability in forage quality. And it's because of that tie to forage maturity. So in their case, they found that the leaf percent accounted for 71% of the variation in relative forage quality. So it really is important and it is very closely tied to forage maturity. There can also be differences in forage species differences. So we have, cool season grasses, warm season grasses. We have legumes that can be made or harvested for hay. We have perennial forages and annual forages, and all of these different things can contain different qualities. And do contain different types of, forage quality based on, their species. So, these are just some very general trends, but I wanted to really quickly touch on some of the differences between like a cool season grass, which is CSG, warm season grass, WSG, and legume in terms of their quality, because this is important and is something that we can choose or we can, make decisions on when we're purchasing or selecting hay, right? We can ask or we can know if the hay is a legume or a legume grass mix, or if it's a cool season grass, or what, the forage species is that's present in that hay. So just some general trends on average. Legumes will typically have a little bit higher digestible energy or a little bit higher energy concentration compared to grass hays. So legumes tend to contain more energy. They also typically tend to contain more protein. So we think of legumes like alfalfa and clover as having a higher energy content and a higher protein content compared to our grasses. And warm season grasses typically contain less protein on average. When it comes to fiber, usually legumes contain a little bit less fiber. Cool season grasses are kind of in the middle, and then warm season grasses typically contain the highest percentage of fiber. So this is showing NDF, neutral detergent fiber, which is a sum of all the different fiber components in a plant. Legumes tend to contain, on average, higher amounts of some of the essential vitamins and minerals. So something like calcium, for example, is usually higher in legume forages than it is in grass forages. And this is important because we know that for a lot of our livestock species, the calcium to phosphorus ratio is really important. And we want to be making sure that we're having a good calcium to phosphorus ratio and supplying enough calcium in the diet. And so legumes having that little bit extra calcium in them, they usually have a higher calcium to phosphorus ratio. For any who, especially in the equine world, are concerned with non-structural carbohydrates, legumes and warm season grasses usually have lower non-structural carbohydrates on average compared to cool season grasses. And then if we look at RFQ, relative forage quality, which is another metric for kind of overall forage quality, we see that on average, legumes typically are the highest, warm season grasses are typically the lowest, and cool season grasses are kind of in the middle. So on average, legumes will be the highest quality, followed by cool season grasses, and warm season grasses will be a little bit more moderate. And you see the caveat there. This is true if everything is, same level of maturity and all other conditions considered equal. Those are the trends. So if we're purchasing hay and selecting hay, we know that normally a legume hay will be a little bit higher quality compared to a grass hay. And this is just visually showing some of those differences. So you can see here, this is relative forage quality, or that overall quality measure for a wide range of different forage types. These were all submitted for testing at the University of Georgia Forage Testing Lab. And if we pull out cool season grasses, you'll see orchard grass here. That's a pretty common cool season grass forage. If we compare that to the average for some warm season grasses like Bahia grass or Bermuda grass, you can see even though there's a wide range in quality, the average shifts slightly to the left, so slightly lower quality. And if we compare that to some of our legumes like alfalfa or other legumes, we see that on average their quality is a little bit higher. So we can see that those trends are holding true, with actual forage data from the lab. So when we're looking at hay visually, we were talking about how do we kind of assess it as we're visually looking at it. For those who aren't familiar, I know it's a little bit hard to tell from a photo, but here you can see photos of alfalfa hay. Hopefully you can see the alfalfa leaves there in the sample on the left versus orchard grass hay in the middle. You can kind of see the seed heads, some of them, and Timothy hay on the right. With the grasses, especially looking at the seed heads, if there are any seed heads, is one of the best ways to tell what type of grass is in that hay. So here's just some examples of some common seed heads for like orchard grass, timothy, fescue, etc. And then on the bottom right there, you can kind of see the difference between more of a grass hay, in this case, orchard grass, versus an alfalfa hay, where you can see alfalfa has a lot more of that leaf material, a little bit less stem material there on average. So it is sometimes hard to tell what exactly a hay is, especially if it's really vegetative and there's no seed heads or any other indicators to go by, but we can tell some things visually. So these are just some things to look for as you're looking at hay and evaluating hay. Another thing to consider is hay color. So if we could launch our third poll, I want you guys to answer which of these two hays you would purchase, either hay A, which is on the left, or hay B on the right. So which one do you think is higher in quality? Oh, and your third option is they're the same. You would buy either of these. So if you were going to buy one of these hays, would you pick hay A, hay B, or either? We'll give everyone a few seconds for answering this one.
Probably the price is different to each one of those.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to assume in this case that the price is the same. So
Okay. Okay.
same price. Yep. If these were the same price, which one would you buy? All right, so we have 17% said hey A on the left, 61% said B on the right, and 22% said that either one is fine, they're the same. So those of you who said that they're the same, you're actually the most correct. So this is the actual forage quality data on these two hays, and you can see actually they're almost the same in forage quality, pretty much identical, even though, you know, we tend to think that a hay that's really green, has that like nice green color, is higher in quality. It's not always the case. So color is one of the things that can be very, very deceptive when you're looking at hay visually. Here you can see, like I said, these two hays are actually very, very similar, almost the same forage quality. So the point here is don't get too hung up on color. It can, you know, sometimes be an indicator, but it's not as important as most people think it is. Sometimes we can get a little bit of discoloration due to a higher forage maturity, which is why we tend to gravitate towards more green haze. But sometimes it's just based on the conditions during field curing. Sometimes it's based on the storage conditions. Like you can see on the right there, sometimes if hay is stored with one side exposed to the sun, that side can get a little bit sun bleached, but on the inside, it's actually really still a nice green color. So even though green is appealing and it can indicate a good quality hay, remember that there can also be undesirable things that could be green also. So, you know, different weeds or other undesirable species that may be present in the hay could also be green. So while we do want to look at color, just remember that it's not the most important thing. I really want to focus more on, you know, the maturity, the leafiness, you know, what species are in that hay more so than what color the hay is. And then another thing to consider is the odor. So of course we want hay that smells, you know, fresh, clean. We don't want to have a lot of musty odor. If it smells really musty and kind of damp, sometimes that indicates that the hay was a little bit wet when it was baled. And if it was, then it will be a little bit more likely to mold. So we want to make sure we're looking at that hay, hopefully finding hay that is dust and mold free. So you can see some examples of some moldy hay over there on the right. Those are things we want to avoid because if it is moldy or dusty, it can, you know, have several negative consequences like decreasing intake, decreasing palatability of that hay for the animals, limiting nutrient absorption, decreasing overall production, and in, you know, worst case scenarios, actually causing some health issues. So we want to ideally avoid hays that are really moldy and have a nice, clean, fresh hay smell. And then the final thing that we want to avoid is some anti-quality factors. So when I say anti-quality factors, I mean kind of a wide variety of things that we don't want in our hay. things like mold and dirt, like we were just talking about, undesirable weedy species that are in there, straw, corn stalks, sticks, garbage, anything like that. You see the example there with the big snake in the hay. Obviously, we don't see that very often, especially not in our areas of the country. Hopefully, you've never seen a snake wrapped up in the hay, but you may see something more like this, right? Where maybe someone was driving by along the road and they threw some litter out of their car and it ended up in the hay field and then ended up getting baled into the hay. And there may be a little bit of trash or some sticks or, straw or something like that that ended up in the hay. So we just want to make sure that we're looking at the hay, looking for presence of any of these kind of anti-quality factors that are not very desirable, and hopefully finding hay that is free from all of these things. So I know I kind of talked a lot about some of these different factors for hay quality. So I kind of compiled them into a list of some questions to ask. So if you're going to purchase hay, some things that might be worth considering asking that are pertaining to hay quality are, if the producer has a forage analysis for the hay. They won't always have one, but some do, and some will provide a forage analysis if you ask. So it's sometimes worth asking for. How mature was the hay when it was cut? Remember that if it was more mature, it's going to be lower in quality. What forage species are present in the hay? Remember that if it has more legumes, it's going to be usually higher in quality compared to the grasses. Where was the hay harvested? In a perfect world, we would avoid hay that was harvested from like roadside ditches, usually because these tend to have a little bit more of those anti-quality factors, like some trash or sticks or other things in them. It's not always the case, but they are more likely to have that. A few other questions are, was the hay rained on? So if hay was rained on as it was drying in the field, we can see some dry matter losses and a loss of some soluble nutrients. So like our non-structural carbohydrates, some of the water-soluble vitamins can leach from hay if it was rained on. So that's an important consideration. It does depend on how much it rained and when that rain fell, but something to ask. If the hay was stored already before you're purchasing it, you can ask, was it stored either inside or under cover? We know that good storage up off the ground, either inside or covered, preserves forage quality. If it was uncovered and it was out exposed to the elements, it'll be a little bit more susceptible to mold from damp or wet conditions or deterioration. And then you can ask if the hayfield was fertilized or if they spray for weeds or just kind of what their general management strategies are. This one, may not necessarily tell you a lot about the quality, but it is something that can be an indicator of a well-managed field. So if someone is taking good care of their hayfields, they're fertilizing, they're using good weed control, they're likely doing a better job and investing more time and energy into their hay production system. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on for forage quality and kind of considerations is to remember that not every species and not every type of animal needs the best of the best when it comes to forage quality, right? I realize that this shows horses and cows, but we're going to apply our sheep and goats to this figure as well. So this is showing basically a range in relative forage quality and different animal needs and kind of where they fall on that spectrum. So on the far left is lower quality, and then as we move to the right is a higher quality or higher nutrient requirement. And so if we think of the dry cow, we could swap that out for a dry ewe or a dry doe, an animal that's at maintenance. They're, not pregnant, they're not lactating. Those will have the lowest nutritional needs and will have the lowest nutrient requirements. As we move our way up, if we swap out a broodmare here for a ewe or a doe that's gestating, especially early gestation, they may see a little bit of a bump in nutritional needs as they move through pregnancy, especially when they get to later in gestation. Then as we continue to move up, we'll switch to lactating. So animals that have had their babies and are lactating are going to have a greater nutrient requirement. Will also depend on how many lambs or kids that they had too. And then usually animals that have kind of the highest nutrient requirement are going to be kind of the really young growing animals and finishing animals in terms of energy, at least. They're going to be needing a lot of energy as they're growing and as they're finishing to really meet their nutritional needs. So that's kind of the spectrum. If we apply some numbers to it, this is just showing some numbers for different classes of sheep and goats. And it shows feed intake, protein, and energy based on a whole range of different categories. But if we focus just on the energy column for a second, we'll see that animals at maintenance, like we said, will have a lower energy requirement as as we move into gestation, especially late gestation and into lactation, we see that energy requirement really increase. And then we see kind of the highest numbers for animals that have just been weaned and are growing really rapidly, and also finishing animals. And the same trends can be for sheep and for goats. So you can see that same pattern here with the dry doe kind of being the lowest. Then we kind of move up as we get into gestation and lactation, and then kind of that young growing animal having a really high energy requirement. So I mention this because we can sort of match our forages with the needs of our animals, especially if we have more than one type of forage available. So for those dry animals, we might pick something that's more of a moderate fiber, lower energy, lower protein. They don't need a whole lot, right? So maybe we can feed them our most mature hay, a nice mature grass hay that's still weed free and of decent quality, but they don't need something with a huge amount of nutrients in it. As we move up the spectrum, an animal that's maybe in early gestation is going to be wanting something that's a little bit more moderate in fiber, moderate in energy, moderate protein. Maybe we bump up to an immature grass hay. And then as we get towards the top of the spectrum, if we have animals that are lactating, especially, if they have multiple young ones with them, they're going to be needing something really low in fiber and high in energy or protein. So maybe we consider an alfalfa hay or alfalfa mix hay of some sort. And remember that you don't have to have each of these types of hays for different animals. It's a spectrum, right? So you can use supplements or other things. If you don't have alfalfa hay, you can supply some extra energy or protein with supplements of other types. But it's all about kind of matching the nutritional needs with the forage quality that we have, and is something to consider as you're selecting and purchasing hay. What type of forages are you going to need to be able to meet those animals' nutritional requirements? All right, and then kind of the last thing, or one of the last things that I wanted to mention was quantity. So figuring out, do we have enough hay to meet our needs for the winter? Especially going into winter, we want to make sure that we have enough hay that we're going to be able to get through the winter comfortably and not be, running out of hay and kind of panicking come late winter that we don't have enough hay to feed our animals through the rest of the year. So things we need to know are the average body weight of our livestock, the number of animals that we have, the average intake. And by intake, I mean basically percent body weight, dry matter intake. And you can see some ranges there that are pretty commonly used for some different classes of animals. It's a range because it depends a lot on their life stage and their demands. So if they're lactating, they're going to be at the high end of those ranges. If they're at maintenance, they're going to be at the low end of those ranges. We need to know how many days we're going to be feeding hay on average. So if you usually run out of pasture, end of October, and you're going to be feeding hay November, December, January, February, March, you're going to maybe want to plan for about 5 months of hay feeding, or whatever the case is for your operation. And then don't forget to factor in some amount of waste. We know that in a perfect world, animals would eat every blade of hay we provide, but depending on how that hay is stored and how that hay is fed, we can see a big range in the amount wasted, up to 60%, which sounds crazy, but there is research showing up to 60% hay waste when feeding animals in the winter. So that's an important thing to factor in when you're figuring out our hay needs as well. So just a quick example of calculating needs. In this case, we have a flock of 30 sheep. They're about 150 pounds, and we're going to say their dry matter intake is 3% of their body weight. We're planning to feed hay for about 5 months, so 150 days, and we're going to factor in about 20% waste to give ourselves a little bit of a buffer there. So if we calculate the amount needed per sheep per day, we take their body weight times their intake as a percentage. So we're going to need about 4.5 pounds per day for each sheep. And then we want to feed them for 5 months or 150 days. So for each of those sheep to get through that 5-month period, we're going to need 675 pounds of hay. And then we don't just have one animal, we have 30. So we want to multiply that by our flock of 30, which brings us to a little over 20,000 pounds of hay that we're going to need for the winter. And then we can't forget the waste factor. So we said we were going to assume about 20% waste. So if we add 20% on top of that 20,000, that brings us to about 24,300 pounds of hay that we're going to plan to have to feed this flock through those 5 months. And if you're using a 900-pound round bale, this would come out to about 27 bales. So that's just a quick example showing kind of how you can walk through steps to figure out roughly how much hay you're going to need to get through the winter months. And then the very last thing to think about is accessibility and transport. So how are you going to bring the hay to your farm? Are you going to go pick it up? Do you have to get it all at once, or are you going to go multiple times? Is the hay producer able to deliver it? Some will be able to deliver for a fee. All those things are important questions that we need to think about so we can have the labor or the equipment that we need to load and unload and stack and store hay as needed. So just an important thing to think about as we're making these purchase decisions. So here's our kind of full list of criteria. So we're considering the type and size of bale, choosing the right fit for our farm based on how many animals we have and what type of hay works best for us. We're going to think about affordability, being able to compare costs on a dollars per ton basis so we can find one that's most economical. For bale weight, again, making sure we're making those price comparisons by weight and not by individual hay bale. For quality, we want to make sure that our hay is in an appropriate forage quality for our animals' needs. We might want to ask the producer questions, things like, maturity of the forage at harvest, what species are in that hay, any anti-quality factors, and we're going to consider how we can match that forage quality with the nutritional needs of our animal. For quantity, we're going to have, do some quick calculations and figure out a rough estimate of how much hay we're going to need to get us through the winter. And then we're going to remember to think about kind of that delivery and transport needs and if we're going to be able to accommodate that. So that's kind of like our checklist and some questions to ask and things to think about as we're, making our hay purchasing decisions and deciding on different hays to select. Hopefully that was helpful for you all. I'm happy to, answer some questions now if there are any. I'll also throw my contact information up here if anyone wants to follow up. Feel free to reach out if you have further questions too.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Grev. I think it's one of the best presentation that I have seen, so complete, so integrated, very good and cool research applied information as education for the farmers. I appreciate very much your presentation. And I don't know if we have some questions for the ones that are asking about the last one, Mark Green. I have the last Monday, I have the video recording. So you send me an email, I can send you the video because right now it's not edited, but I can send you as the way that is right now. And also remember that we have for the, can you stop sharing your screen, please? Mm, we have for the next Monday, Dr. Ken Coffey talking about from Arkansas University, talking about balance situations. So I don't know you have any specific questions for Dr. Grev.
Someone asked if I could go back to the calculation slide, so I just clicked back.
Okay, good.
They can see that. If they have questions, feel free to follow up, but
Yeah, just remember that all this presentation, Dr. Greb, will be recorded and will be in the YouTube channel that we are going to be later on sharing. Also, please, for those ones that didn't write your name, write it. Some of them have like an iPad, and so we are going to make a some raffle of some books, uh, so at least one book per per Monday. So for those ones that are participating, we have the opportunity. We have some meat god handbooks, some butchering books, racing god, dairy god. So you may select the book that you want if you are the one that are winning. So you have other questions there?
yeah, I see someone asked about a lab for test results for sprouted grains. I'd have to, off the top of my head, I don't, but I'd have to look at like the analysis list on some of the labs. Some of the labs that have like a really full profile, if you will, of different test options would be Dairy One, which is up in Ithaca, New York, Cumberland Valley Analytical, which is in Pennsylvania. Those would be two of the ones I would look at initially, but I'd have to go look. I haven't looked for that specific analysis to see, but I'm happy to check or help check and follow up if you can't find like where to look for the right thing.
Okay. Now, for those ones that are asking about the recordings of the previous talks, every time that I send a new the reminder of a new talk, I will send the video links of the previous ones so that you can just link to those ones. I don't know if there is any other question. Well, as I said, Dr. Dr. Greb, thank you so much for your participation. We appreciate very much. You were awesome, very complete, really, really.
No problem. Thank
I
you for the
yeah
invite.
yeah I have been working for a long time in forages, and I know that the hay is one of the issues, the main issues for the people to be not feeding good their animals. So they are making, that's the reason we are making that emphasis during this winter certificate classes about talking about costs, how to be making a good hay, how balancing rations and all these things. And because also represents a high cost for the farmers. Yeah. Well, thank
Makes sense when forages make up such a big component of their diets. It's important to consider. So
yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
yes, thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yeah, Thanksgiving for everyone.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Grave. It was great to have you here, and we learned a lot. New information.
good. Good. I'm glad.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Salinas.
Yep. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.